when the earth moves right before your eyes. We will lead each other back to solid ground.
Writers is made possible in part by a generous grant from the William Battle and Sarah Mel Repshire Crooks Foundation, celebrating the legacy of Mississippi's Eudora Welty. Hello, I'm Gene Edwards. Welcome to Writers. This time, Katrina. It was 5 years ago, August 2005, when that terrible storm slammed into the Mississippi Gulf Coast and changed lives forever. Now, 5 years later, the rebuilding has begun. But it's not just structures that are being rebuilt, it's lives, it's hopes, it's stories of passion and drama. All those stories this time on Writers, and told by three different styles of writing. Stan Tyner, he's editor of the Biloxi Sun Herald. He says his staff practiced journalistic triage every day. Out of thousands of possible stories, they published the ones which would help people survive, and they won a Pulitzer Prize for public service. Ellis Anderson, during the grinding aftermath when she says the real struggle began, she discovered communities of people who took care of each other. She began a blog so friends across the country could know their plight and their progress. And Tom Piazza, a New Orleans resident who evacuated to Missouri, he was powerless as he watched his city steep in a toxic stew. He captures the camaraderie as well as the concern in two books about Katrina. Stan and Ellis and Tom, welcome. We're glad to have you here for this conversation about Katrina, who changed all of our lives, didn't she? Where were you?
In my house in Gulfport.
Yeah. So you wrote out the storm in your house, not at the newspaper?
No. But some did at the newspaper, but got to the newspaper that afternoon.
What was the first official word that the newspaper received after it passed? What was the...
Well, there wasn't much official word because everything was so dispersed. The information was not centralized at that point.
What was the first report you could trust?
Well, was what I saw with my eyes. I drove down to the beach and saw the world that I used to know had gone away. Didn't exist anymore. The landmarks that we knew that represented the coast of Mississippi had been obliterated. Then began to do what you do, is report on what had happened.
You were in Missouri? Where were you?
Yeah, I had been in Virginia that August working on a novel, and I was about to come back down to New Orleans that weekend that Katrina hit. I called my better half, Mary, and I said, hey, I'll see you tomorrow. It takes a day and a half to drive down from where I was. And she said, well, you will, but it won't be in New Orleans. It'll be in Missouri because we're evacuating. So I drove down and across Tennessee and met them in Missouri, and from there we watched, as you said, Stan, the destruction basically of the life.
But New Orleans for a long time thought that they were out of the woods.
Yes, because at the last moment the storm had jogged east somewhat, so what happened in New Orleans wasn't even a direct hit. The city had hideous storm damage, nothing, obviously compared to the tsunami that hit the Gulf Coast, but the real disaster that happened in New Orleans wasn't the natural disaster of Katrina, it was the failure of the levees. And
we'll get back to it in a minute. Why in the world did you stay?
A lot of people have asked that question. It's a great one. If you're from the Gulf Coast and you're facing a long and tedious and sort of dangerous often evacuation process, and then your property is on high ground, and I think most people on the coast are more fearful of storm surge damage than wind damage. And if you're on very high ground and your property hasn't flooded in some of the big storms like Camille, some people in my neighborhood, including myself, made the decision to stay rather than try to evacuate at the last minute.
Your home was a former schoolhouse, is that right?
It was built in 1913 as a school, and it was a big raised building. And it's actually, I think the elevation is 24 feet. And so it's some of the highest property in the Gulf Coast. It's Bay St. Louis is kind of built on a ridge. I and a lot of my neighbors felt like the storm surge was not going to be an issue. And so hey, it seemed like a no-brainer. And I was there. I
So the
didn't
wind
mean
blows,
to be.
wind blows all night, the morning comes, one of your friends comes over, and then what happened?
Total chaos. I had friends call me and they told me that the storm surge was supposed to be worse in Bay St. Louis and Waveland, and that was supposed to hit around 8:30. And so at 9 o'clock when the water starts coming up the street, it's like, oh my gosh, that's not it. And I've never been more afraid in my entire life. It really took everybody by surprise. We were very fortunate, not more people died. Emergency workers I talked to told me that if it had come in at nighttime, the death toll would have been much greater. So we were very fortunate it came in the day. I was still totally naive. Afterward, in the afternoon when the winds had died down, I took a walk around my neighborhood. There were houses off of foundations, trees, roofs gone. But as I walked toward the front, it was totally obliterated. And just like Stan was saying, and the whole town is gone. And I knew from seeing that if our little part of town, which was on the highest ridge of land, was gone, the rest of the coast didn't have a chance. And so the implications, I was looking at a few blocks of destruction, but I knew without a doubt what had transpired on the rest of the coast, and it was like the world ended.
You wrote that was one of the huge challenges in the whole thing, was that the width of the destruction was so incredible. How do you report that kind of a story?
Well, I think you do it in digestible bites as you see it. In this case, there was no one that initially that saw the complete breadth of the coast. They saw it from the vantage point of wherever they survived. Almost every citizen of the coast had a high water mark in their mind that was established by Camille. Mm-hmm. And so there were people literally who died in their homes because they said, here's where my daddy showed me that the water came to, and I don't have to worry about anything grander than that.
This is the worst it's ever going to be.
It's worst it can be. And I guess if there's among the many lessons that we will have learned from Katrina, one will be don't trust this as a high water mark, but leave Dodge.
How long was it before you knew what had happened in Bay St. Louis?
Within 24 hours, we had a pretty good picture of what had happened from state line to state line. You know, we recognized not every piece of the story, but we had a pretty good abstract of what had occurred at that time. We did not publish in Mississippi, but we had sent a crew up to Columbus, Georgia, and never missed a publication.
Where's the first one that came out?
Which is our tsunami. Tom mentioned that. Mayor Holloway came in late on the first day, and you know, he told us about what had happened in Biloxi, for example, and he came in and said, this is our tsunami, and that was a headline. I know we had a big discussion in our newsroom about this, that to compare what had happened to us to a tsunami in the Indian Ocean seemed a stretch, and having seen that we didn't have anything standing, we didn't know what the casualty numbers were going to be, but we knew that it was like a tsunami and that we had been knocked down pretty hard.
What we are looking at is Katrina and different ways of writing about Katrina. You began writing nonfiction first before you wrote your novel, From Far Away.
Right. We were kind of encamped at this farm in southeastern Missouri, and right afterwards we had no idea what had happened where in New Orleans. It was very hard to get any kind of reliable news reports out of there. The entire communication grid had gone down. When we found out that 85% of the city was underwater, it was, of course, a devastating thing to find out. I was up in Missouri, and you know, it was the very beginning of fall, and so people were going about their daily lives, and there was this eerie kind of unreality about it. In the middle of that first week, my editor at HarperCollins called me up and asked if there was anything that they could do, because I had no idea if I had anything left in my house, if anything was there. And I said, well, I don't know, I'm kind of going crazy. You know, and maybe if there's something I don't know, if I could write something, but I don't know what. And so we talked about it a little bit, and we came up with the idea of writing this short book, which became Why New Orleans Matters.
Because to a lot of people it didn't matter.
Right.
A lot of people said, well, why would you bother to rebuild that?
Right. And I think the most infamous remark of that kind came from, at that time, the House Speaker Dennis Hastert, who said, it looks like they could just go in there and bulldoze all that. You know, which is, of course, a very easy thing for somebody to say at a remove of a couple thousand miles or however long it was. So, the Why New Orleans Matters was conceived as a kind of answer to that kind of ignorant prattle. So I began writing the book in Missouri, and what I did initially was started talking about all the touchstones of a life and a continuity that you've lived for as long as you've lived there. I started the book by trying to summon all these memories of New Orleans and all these things that were so characteristic of New Orleans and why it seemed to me as if it had to live. And in the middle of writing that, I made my first trip back home, just about 2 weeks after the disaster. And so the second part of the book became about that visit.
And you looked around, and what did you think?
Well, there were different kinds of disasters in a way. The odd thing about New Orleans was that most of the city was still there. I mean, there were roofs blown off, there were trees down, all kinds of just incredible storm damage, of course, but the city was still there. It wasn't like Bay St. Louis, where it looked as if a giant monster from outer space had come and bit off half the street. That was like something out of a science fiction movie. What it was the entire city was empty of people. So it was more like one of those science fiction movies where you come someplace after a nuclear attack and the buildings are still there, but all the people are gone, like a Twilight Zone or something. It was terrible. It was like, the closest thing I could say would be, it would be like visiting your dearest friend or your mother or your spouse in the hospital when they were in a coma after a catastrophic stroke and you didn't know if they were going to make it. It was that kind of depth of feeling.
But it did fuel you, didn't it? Because you wrote that in just a matter of months.
5 weeks.
Weeks.
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit like being shot out of a catapult. You know, I mean, sometimes, and I'm sure you both can speak to that, when your back is against the wall, very often is when you're the most focused. And I think that can show up sometimes in the writing. If something cataclysmic happens and you have to write about it under pressure, you can focus to an unusual degree.
Gene, what occurs to me in a conversation about the Katrina narrative is that there are layers of it that just keep occurring. Someone will write a book about it 50 years from now, and it will have a grander sweep and understanding of what it meant to America, to the people that lived through it, and so forth. But initially for the newspaper, for the Sun Herald, it was in the here and now, and there were literally 1,000 stories that we could write every day that we knew about, that were great stories. So we committed what we said was journalistic triage to try to sit down and analyze what stories were the most important, had the most usefulness, utilitarianism in the here and now for people to survive in those moments, in those days. And now you see some of the journalism that occurs is a little bit more detached. It has a more cerebral aspect to it, but we felt like there was a psychological aspect to what we were reporting. And one of the examples that I will give of what we were doing, if I can find the right paper, the one that says Hope Amid Ruin. Well, here was one to help us now. This was in the phase when we were...
That was the third day.
Yeah, we were not, nothing was happening much. The volunteers were coming. There were some really capable people that came and held our hand and made us get through those hours. And there were people in the government who were doing some good things for us, but there were a lot of people who were not getting it. So this headline spoke to the nation from the heart of the region and represented, I think, the voice of what South Mississippi was feeling at the time. But we had one the day that a lot of bodies were discovered, and we had a striking image of bodies being brought out. They were in a sort of a transparent sheet of plastic, and they were holding in the light. It was backlit. It was a very dramatic, powerful photograph. But we also had a picture of a son and a mother that were reuniting, and you can see the sea of rubble, and they were hugging. And so you could argue, what was the more important sort of global story there? Is it about the bodies are now coming, the bodies are coming out of the rubble? And our headline, we went with the bigger image on the son and mother hugging in the rubble, and the headline was Hope Amid Ruin. Mm-hmm. I mean, it would have been real easy just to have had a headline every day that would be discouraging and talk about the death and destruction and how nobody was getting the goods and services they should. But we felt like the very core of Mississippi people are, particularly as we know them on the coast, the toughness of spirit, no matter what's dished out, we're going to keep going, and that's what people did. And the paper tried to synthesize and represent the spirit of the coast in the papers that we printed then.
I have spoken to a number of people on the coast who are still angry, saying that New Orleans got all the attention and still gets all the attention. Is that?
Do you want a response to that?
So why did you feel that way down there?
Did I feel what
Did
way?
you feel that New Orleans was getting enough attention or too much attention?
Well, certainly in the 5 days after the storm, New Orleans wasn't getting enough attention, just the way the Mississippi Gulf Coast wasn't getting enough attention. But, you know, as far as comparing the Mississippi Gulf Coast and New Orleans, it's apples and oranges. They're two different events. What happened on the Gulf Coast was a natural disaster of epic proportions, and it was like a giant bomb went off. I think if New Orleans has gotten more coverage, more attention, however you want to put it, it may be because it's a gigantic city. It's a city of 500,000 people with enormously complex social problems, with you know, a history and a culture that, whether, you know, whatever else you want to say, people are familiar with or think they're familiar with it. So it was perhaps on people's radar a little bit more than the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And there's a very heavy dimension of human responsibility for the disaster that did happen in New Orleans, which, as we were saying before, was more of a man-made or a disaster that has roots in human, what's the word, just incompetence or lack of foresight. Whereas the Mississippi Gulf Coast just got, it's as if a meteor hit it from outer space, just wham.
How long was it before you began to get help?
The National Guard arrived on Thursday in Bay St. Louis.
The storm was on Monday.
Right, and so, I just kept thinking every day somebody was going to arrive. In fact, I felt as an American, sort of like if something happened, the Guard, the Army, somebody would be there like immediately. I felt entitled, and maybe that's a spoiled way to feel, but I had a 92-year-old woman in my house on a catheter who had not been able to evacuate and spent the storm at my house. There was no air conditioning. I was having to bathe her with water out of my tub and try to keep her clean and hope, you know, she could make it. And there was nobody to come get her out. And those days seemed really, really, really long.
Because it was
every
really
one
hot,
of
and it was
every one of those
brutal.
days seemed like a week.
Were you able to get radio communication there? I mean, how much were you able to get in touch with the media?
We had some radio communication. I wasn't really listening that much because most of the radio communication was about New Orleans, and there wasn't that much about what was happening in our area. And I understood that. New Orleans is an international celebrity. So I think that was natural on the other hand, but I'm like, what about us? And it seemed like not much was happening in depth in the national viewpoint. And that's, I mean, the Sun Herald pointed that out a lot of times.
we did talk about it, but they are different stories. We recognize that New Orleans, we talked about really when the levee broke, there was a giant sucking sound in South Mississippi, and that was the national media heading heading west. It's true. And they were mostly gone. They would come back and visit and do a piece 90 days out or something like that. But for the most part, that gave us a greater responsibility to do what we could to tell it.
When did you start writing? You kept a notebook or kept notes?
Yeah,
But when did you start?
I did my first essay. I'd have to look back at the exact date, but I think it was in October. And it took me kind of I think to get my head around the enormity and the scope of it. But I did it in response to friends and family around the country that had no idea what was going on at all. And I wanted to be able to communicate some of that. And
Was
then,
the first piece you wrote, was it the one that began, "There's a man sleeping in my driveway"?
Actually, I think that was, I'd have to look back now, Katrina mine. But I think that was the second one. I think the first one I wrote was one called "The Ties That Bind," and it was describing how Bay St. Louis was our little Mayberry by the sea. The extraordinary thing about this event to me was the fact that a major catastrophe hits a contemporary American community, wipes it out to a level and a scope, not only itself, but all the neighboring communities that would normally be able to help support it. And things did not degenerate into chaos, and people clung together.
People were sharing what they had in their refrigerators. And
definitely, and they not only stood up for each other and risked their lives during the storm itself in many, many cases to help each other survive afterward, when the really grinding part of the aftermath set in. People were astonishingly generous, and to me, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever witnessed in my life. And what I started out, I think, writing about a weather event, a catastrophe, started becoming about, how is this working? Why are these people taking care of each other? It's been an amazing thing to witness, and I think that's...
And tell the story of.
So
did you begin posting things online? Is that?
I emailed it first to friends, and we were very fortunate, like Stan was saying, about how we got up pretty quickly on a lot of different levels on the Gulf Coast. I had internet communication, so I would send letters to friends, and then a friend of mine said, well, you should put up a blog.
What was it originally called?
I called it Katrina Patina was the address, because that was...
because everything had a Katrina
Patina to it. It was just our local slang and what life was like after we had this experience we couldn't seem to wash off, that had changed us. I just kept writing. It's just
well, there's so many moving
long
things.
Process.
You wrote about the shrines that began cropping up everywhere.
I'm not saying that we were perfect in the Gulf Coast or Bay St. Louis in particular, and I focused on Bay St. Louis to narrow the lens. It was the only way I could sort of make sense out of the experience because it was so big. One of the things that blew my mind was you could drive down the street and see where neighbors who had been back had salvaged items that they recognized as belonging to other neighbors whose houses were destroyed, and set it up on the edge of the lot. So you'd drive down and you'd see somebody's family portrait propped up at the edge of a tree that still stood at the edge of the property, and some vases and some teacups and some china and silver candlesticks. I call them little shrines. And that way, when the people were able to eventually make it back to their property, there might not be much left, but they had a few mementos left of their property. And that spoke a lot of the whole attitude of how people were there.
Would you read something for us from Why New Orleans Matters?
Sure. You know, it's, as a little prelude to this, it's so moving hearing you talk about the way people helped each other in the aftermath of it. And it was so much the case in New Orleans as well. When we came back about 2 weeks after Katrina, it was hard to bear, that visit. And it just basically you kind of take stock, you grab a couple things, and then you turn and leave. And I'm going to read a little section that's just about what we saw as we were leaving town, just shell-shocked. And again, the town was empty of people, pretty much. There was nobody around. There weren't even birds. I don't know if you had that on the Gulf Coast.
You wrote about not hearing birds.
No birds, no sounds, no air conditioners, no cars going by, no televisions, no nothing, no insects. I remember the first time we saw a big cockroach. When we were walking down the street, we saw a cockroach, and we got misty. We're like, oh, look, there's a cockroach. But anyway, I'm going to read this little section. As we were on our way out of town, we saw what almost seemed to be a mirage. It was this little store with a couple people sitting outside, apparently enjoying a beer or something at these little picnic tables. And there were people there. It's just like a girl in a Catholic school uniform, a couple of guys who look like roofers, pickup truck parked outside, painted purple, green, and gold. This odd little assemblage of folks who had gathered. And this is a description of the inside of the store. Inside the dark, cement-floored store, where the lights were still off, a woman known as Sister was dispensing free sodas and beers and sandwiches. "We got plenty," she said. "We never know what we're going to have, but we'll have something. Have a sandwich. There's beers in the ice chest if you want one." The familiar sound of welcome, the New Orleans sound. We had a beer. Who knew where this stuff had come from? Who cared? And I ate a couple of pieces of white bread with a slice of ham inside. And we sat outside at one of the picnic tables talking to various folks who came and went. And as we sat there, the worst of what I had been thinking and feeling in mid-city began to even out a little. The sense of eerie soullessness and devastation began to be balanced out by just so much with the fact of human contact and communion. A restatement of the fact that we are here, that as long as we are here, we can at least eat and drink and make some jokes. No, we ain't trying to make any money off this. This is all free as long as we can do it. Take whatever you want. Just to sit outside for a while and share the fact of that moment with some other people was enough to relight that pilot light that had blown out for about a half hour in mid-city. There was that echo from somewhere of thank you. Thank you for this sandwich and this cold drink, and for the voices of these other people all around. We sat there for the better part of an hour, and by the time we left, our spiritual gas tank, which had been below empty, had filled just enough to carry us the next leg of the trip at least. And if that sound and that feeling could be rekindled in the midst of all that chaos, then I knew New Orleans had a chance.
Do you remember the first time you laughed after it was over?
I think I laughed during the event. It was easy to laugh at myself, at how absurd my...
There's this photo of you that afternoon.
Well, that was eventually used as a cover of the book. I actually have a little half smile on my face because I haven't walked out and seen the neighborhood. I think the worst is over, and I have no idea what I'm going to see. And it was the end of my innocence, but I found myself thinking such absurd trains of thought. They were really pretty comical at times, and I don't know if that's an average way of behaving under stress, but and my neighbors and my friends all seemed to pull on humor a lot to get through that really, really bad time, and I think that had a lot to do with the way people stood up to things. So I would say it was not that long before I laughed. And in fact, this part about the Baytown Inn is that they were able to laugh under incredible stress, life-threatening conditions.
Let's talk about the Baytown Inn, because It was one of my favorite places down there. In fact, my wife and I stayed in room number 5 at the top of the stairs. And
That's amazing.
yeah, and that, when I got to that section in your book, I thought, oh my gosh, what happened at the Baytown Inn?
Well, it was interesting because there were 7 people there. 5 of them told me their stories, and I sort of interwove them. As you can imagine, under the extreme duress of a historic bed and breakfast going down around your ears, and all of these people were over 50. 2 of them were 80. They thought it would be a safe place to ride out the storm. It had not suffered during Camille. One of the wild facts is that one of the people who stayed in the Baytown Inn for the storm was a professional hurricane hunter and had flown into Katrina just the day before. And so he should have supposedly known us that maybe to get out of the way. But he felt very secure in that building as well. It was 5 feet off the ground on the bluff, and it had made it through innumerable storms, really bad storms. And so they felt safe there, and then the building
Would you
gets
read
destroyed.
some of what you wrote?
This takes place after everyone has sort of gone from having a little safe place downstairs, and then they realize the downstairs is getting eaten up by the waves, so they run upstairs. Everybody goes into room number 5. The waves break through the front door, pull out this magnificent staircase, and these people are like, whoa. The doorway to number 5 suddenly opened directly onto an ocean writhing in fury. The front rooms no longer existed. The floor of the hallway had been sucked into the surf. The room behind Kevin began to distort as it pulled back away from the back of the house. Nikki screamed as she saw Kevin's danger. He vaulted toward the others from the crumbling remains of his perilous perch. Propelled by adrenaline, Kevin cleared a 6-foot rift that dropped away to certain death below. He made it to the threshold of room number 5 and was pulled by the others into the last safe haven. But it wasn't a haven for long. Number 5 became the only survivor of the house when the remaining back rooms on both sides were pulled away. As the final supports of the first floor gave way, number 5 settled onto the heaving surface of the sea. The walls and the ceiling of the room began to cave in on the group. The men struggled to keep it from collapsing onto them while the floor rippled beneath their feet. They weren't able to save the front wall. The churning water devoured their last protection from the elements. Now 7 people and 2 dogs found themselves in a shifting shell open to the fury of the storm. Hello, Gulf of Mexico, Doug thought. He realized that the room had become a little boat and one that was about to sink. Gusts blasted them with bullets of rain. As they fought to keep the ceiling from falling onto them, the room twisted in the water. The open front of number 5 now faced toward the rear of the lot. A large oak tree that grew in the backyard came into view. Doug shouted to be heard over the wind, urging his friends to enter the water and make for the tree. Nadine, who was 79, still calm, answered resolutely, "I'm not going into the water," she said. "I can't swim." Dick, her husband, held her close against his side. He was going nowhere without his wife. The group faced imminent death, but the Cajun and Kevin couldn't resist the opening for a good line. As he strained against the ceiling to hold it in place, he looked at Doug and grinned. "Houston, we have a problem," he yelled. And I think people used humor as a way to deal with the horror of these life-threatening situations.
Did they all make it?
Yes, they all did.
That's the miracle, isn't it?
It is the miracle.
How many of those stories have you heard?
Well, they're endless.
Yeah. How many stories has the paper written since then?
I haven't counted.
At one point it was 2,800 or something.
Yeah, well, the first several months, we didn't print any news other than Katrina news. We eventually decided that, coming back to what the people need, they needed, and what do they need in Mississippi? They needed some sports news. We figured so we did 2 things: the comics. We brought the comics back. The first, things other than Katrina news were the comics and sports. And you know, I've got to give a Saints plug in this conversation. There is nothing in the time since that has caused spirits to soar like this year's Saints. I mean, everybody, you know, really, New Orleans is the city that South Mississippi does. It's our city. It's the place we go to, and you come to play and be a part of our world in South Mississippi. So there's a lot of social and cultural intercourse between the two places. But there has been a lot of anguish in our part of the world, as you would know. People have truly, truly suffered physically and psychologically and economically. Then came the Saints, and everybody, you know, talking about a uniting force in the Gulf Coast region, but I would say especially between New Orleans and South Louisiana and South Mississippi, has been the success of that team. So you could literally see the twinkle in people's eyes come back, the sort of a lift in their step, and a sense of swagger that we had perhaps lost a little bit of.
Let me ask you about something that we dealt with all the time. How did you fact check? How were you able to keep the rumors, to keep the lies?
Well, we really had a standard from the beginning. We basically held hands and said, we're going to do this the right way. This is the biggest story we have ever encountered and hope to God to ever encounter. And you know, we want to do it right. And we recognized that bad journalism could be harmful to everybody. If we put out something that it wasn't accurate, that gave people the wrong idea or caused them to panic because they thought there was some terrible affliction that was about to come. So we really vetted all the news that we had very, very thoroughly and said we're just not going to print it.
But how could you do that? Because you don't normally have, you know, you didn't have telephones, you didn't have a lot of the sources that you normally go to.
Well, but we did have. In fact, that was the local advantage, is the hometown. We knew where places were, we knew where people were, and we had the Rolodex. Nobody from the New York Times or CBS or any other place had the Rolodex that we had. And I would also give the local officials high marks. I think they went to extraordinary lengths to get it right. So I don't recall an era of big fact that occurred during that period that we had to correct. And most of the stories, we were sitting there talking to the person, you know, just like you gave a first person interview. You talked to people that experienced something, and you talked to people that were there and saw it and did it. So it was, I mean, I would say it was an unusual opportunity for reporters to deal with first-person stories that they could see, you know, here we are, this is where it happened. You didn't make up the fact that this house was destroyed, and here's the tree that you held to, and here's the dog that you held on to and survived with you. And a lot of old people especially died because of pets, but that's another.
But the pet stories were also one of the rumors that went on too, because there were a lot of rumors about euthanizing pets that didn't happen, just wasn't true.
Well, a lot of people also in New Orleans stayed at home because of pets. And, you know, you said something that was so true, Ellis, which was, you know, I think a lot of people who aren't from this area don't think about the enormous logistical challenges involved in evacuating every time a hurricane's brewing someplace.
I really appreciated your story of the evacuation and City of Refuge.
Oh, thank you.
That was like really real. That was great.
Well, I mean, but that's it. You know, people say, well, why didn't you leave? You heard this hurricane. Well, you know, if you have a car in the first place, getting grandma in there, you know, who's disoriented, and getting your pets in there, or maybe not your pets, but just loading up the car with the kids every time a hurricane is brewing in the Gulf, even a big hurricane, going someplace and, you know, spending money to be in a hotel for a few nights, spending money to eat out, and for people who are, you know, maybe poor or don't have a car, it's just logistically unrealistic.
Well, and if you remember, 2004 was really a bad hurricane year. So there were several false alarms. People evacuated when, you know, they said the evacuation was worse than the hurricane might have been.
Yeah.
And so they had those memories. You know, I spent 12 hours getting to Hattiesburg or something, you know, and they just didn't want to do it again. They didn't have any confidence in the weather. They just took a took a holiday, and it was a mistake in many
They took a
cases.
chance. Would you read something for us from one of your editorials, from one of your, which got a lot of attention?
Well, I think what I'll do, this is, we did a couple
This
of
is
books.
marvelous.
This is the next layer of the way the Sun Herald tried to tell the story. You know, to me, there was a lot of power in the visual images that we saw. So our storytelling was in words, but the photographs were also very, very strong, I thought. The comments I'll read from the and I talked about the stress on the staff, and that's one of the things that, you know, as a consequence of Katrina, everything, the way we were organized as a newsroom before Katrina really didn't make much sense afterwards. Everybody became a reporter and was covering the news. Beats that didn't exist before existed. And every journalist, everybody that worked at the newspaper, whether they were in the business office or an ad salesman, of course we weren't selling many ads in those days, they delivered newspapers. And so our staff has really been a champion to me. They've inspired me as an editor to keep going because they've worked hard. And I talked about the around-the-clock effort and the stress produced by personal losses and the constant scenes of destruction took their toll. The shared pain of staff, including the dozens of news team volunteers, was palpable. For the paper and the community, we're a long way from normal, but we're rebuilding and recovering together. The words, the images, the design have blended into the telling of an incredible story, one whose last chapter is far beyond our dim vision. And one of the things that was written before the storm, I don't know whether you know about the weather on the ground, but at the Sun Herald, that's a weather source that we paid a lot of attention to. We had watched it in the '04 season, and it had a lot of credibility with us. And the day before the storm, their weather blogger said it's going to hit, you know, if you're in Bay St. Louis specifically, it's going to be a 34-foot surge. Get out now. This is going to kill a lot of people. And so the last paper we printed before Katrina was another Camille ? Well, little did we know that, yes, it would be that and more. And it says in this, we were talking about the paper's role. We knew we were in a lot of trouble. A front page editorial in last Monday said, "Those who have chosen to remain are expected to experience one of the greatest furies that nature can unleash. The storm is almost certain to change the face of South Mississippi forever." How prophetic. But never in our most expanded vision of the impact of Katrina did our nightmare reach the apocalyptic proportion that became reality over the course of last Monday, and on from there. And it's still, you know, it's the story that, you know, defines our newspaper and our region, and you as citizen journalists like Ellis and authors as Tom, because it's now a part of who we are as people, and it's hard to see.
That's right.
The remainder of the world. And the other thing that has happened in terms of us, I think one of the tensions that we've tried to do is to try to help lead the community to get beyond Katrina. We can't live in it forever. And you know, other things have happened in the world. The Katrina story is not the biggest story. The wars have been waged. Great cataclysmic events have happened to people in far places that have killed tens of thousands. So we understand we're not the center of the universe that we were for a long time. The nation has been enormously generous to us. Our debts are great, our hearts are large, but really in our mind, it's getting to where we're going is a big part of the story. What is the recovery, and really for every person, trying to bring everybody to that place so we get there together seems to be the task that's on our mind a lot.
We've talked a lot about the facts of the story, the nonfiction story of Katrina, but now Katrina's becoming a topic for novels, for people who see this as an event like the Civil War or any other major historical event. And Your City of Refuge was one of the first novels that came out of it. Why? Why did you want to write that?
Why fiction? You said, why did I want to write the book? I didn't want to write the book. That was the joke of it, actually. When I had finished Why New Orleans Matters, I ended up traveling an awful lot, talking about it. And by about, January or February, I needed a little break from it. Just as we were saying, you need to joke, you need to think about something else. There are other things going on. I was like, oh boy. But the one thing that had happened was in all that time talking about the city and about the disaster as a kind of public platform, I hadn't really been processing my own personal grief and all the emotional weather that you go through. And I had a small residency in Virginia. I thought I'd use the time just to kind of collect myself and take some notes and think about what the next project would be. And lo and behold, this book actually started. You hear writers say it, and it always sounds like a literary conceit or something. But it actually sort of started to write itself. The characters suggested themselves with an immediacy that I'd never really experienced before. But suddenly, the characters in City of Refuge, S.J. Williams, who's a carpenter who built his own house down in the lower Ninth Ward, and whose family had lived there for generations. His sister Lucy and her son Wesley, and then this other family was the family of Midwestern transplants who came to the city because they chose to be there. And the husband is the editor of the alternative news weekly in New Orleans, and his wife, who sort of is ready maybe to leave New Orleans a little bit even before Katrina happens. Anyway, all those people are sort of pushed off the cliff by the disaster and have to make their decisions about whether to come back or not. But as to the question of why fiction and what things fiction can bring to the table that perhaps documentary work can't. It's not a question of one being better than the other. One thing that fiction can do and is supremely good at doing when it's good is being able to see large scale events in terms of the innermost life of individuals, extremely subjective lives of individuals. And then it also affords you the opportunity to see the deeply emotional and psychological lives of individuals in terms of large forces of which they may not even be aware. Now, of course, great journalism can do this up to a certain point. Right. But as a journalist, I think, isn't it true that there's always that little line that you can't quite ever feel entitled to cross the line into another individual's innermost psychology? You have to respect that distance that we all have. We can never truly know. You can learn everything about a person, but you don't know what they're thinking about at 3:30 in the morning. As a novelist, you have to have that confidence that you have that sense of your characters. In any case, what a novel can do, in principle at least, is give you the large framework and the small framework as working parts of one another.
But we're going to see it. I think that we're going to see this storm become the background for lots of stories.
Well, actually, it's true, and I've been working this past year. David Simon, who was the sort of
Tremmy project,
right,
the HBO project.
Right. There's going to be this dramatic series. I'm one of the writers on that.
I think that's going to be exciting, and I think we're all interested in. Spike Lee is doing a follow-up, and actually is paying some attention to our part of the world, so that's going to be interesting. But I think, in a way, that it's such an epic event that it's like setting off pinballs that are bouncing off, and you don't know where they're going to be. You've got a citizen journalist that has, told stories and bears witness to her community. And incidentally, I hope that as journalists, we break through a little bit and get more depth. I think that will be one of the constructs of new journalism.
The next step on the new journalism. What will you do next? Do you keep blogging?
Actually, no, I think I'm like done. You know, I'm a lot like Tom, and I blogged for about a year, and I covered the events of the actual storm in the first 10 days of the aftermath, which is basically the first half of the book. And then I just needed to take a break, and but I kept notes, and it became clear to me at the end of the first year that the threat that we faced ending as a community was not just with the storm. There were other things that were long-term problems that we were going to have to deal with: insurance, post-traumatic stress syndrome, other things. So the second half of the book is a long-term look at the next 3 years of recovery. And so the book ends on the 3rd anniversary of Katrina, when Bay St. Louis, oddly enough, had I was helping organize, the chamber organize a little festival for town. Instead of bemoaning Katrina, we were going to be looking to the future and all the wonderful, great things ahead. And so
what happened?
We were having New Day in the Bay. And then Gustav came and turned it into, we joked, Doomsday in the Bay, or Run Away from the Bay. And so the last chapter, and inadvertently I'd sworn I would never ride out another hurricane, and just the events piled up, and I ended up staying for Gustav. So the last chapter of the book is a look back at the, how we've done over the last 3 years, and it actually opens with me in the middle of another hurricane. But it ends with a tour of the town after Gustav left, which really made a huge impression on me, because it really was still New Day in the Bay. And I think what Stan was talking about earlier about us building back more resiliently was very, very apparent then. And I drove out and I was just taking notes and had my camera. I took a picture of the mail being delivered in Bay St. Louis the next day after a hurricane. Most of my neighbors did not even lose power. Obviously, it's something we're going to have to be dealing with for decades and centuries to come. Storms are not going to go away. I was very proud of the way that we had approached from an early time the building back. Okay, we got to make it tougher. We're not perfect, but we are really stronger. And
well, you know what's interesting in hearing your discussion of this is, this is the patterns of migration. People come. There's a self-selection process, those that don't like that. And there are plenty of people who could no longer tolerate the thought of another hurricane, of trying to survive that. And they literally went away very quickly, some of those folks did, because it was too painful to imagine. But you have stayed. I don't know why you stayed for Gustav. That's
it was an accident, I promise.
But the way you have described yourself is you have morphed into or evolved into a coastian. You're part of the fabric of the South Mississippi that exists post Katrina, and your voice is added to it. And one of the things I meant to say in talking about how these pinballs are bouncing around is that our paper has really been enriched by the voice of readers telling their stories. So we've had, literally hundreds of thousands of storytellers. They contribute to the paper and to our website and have discussions about what's going on and participate in a democratic way, but in a very literary way that makes, I think, our paper quite valuable and important to what's going on in South Mississippi.
I think, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is the fact that the great honor that came to your paper was the Pulitzer Prize, which doesn't happen very often. And I know that you're pretty reserved about talking about it, but this is one of the things that you said that day when the award was announced. So I look back across the fog and the chasm of the months since, and I remember not just the death and the devastation, but also the courage and the spirit and the love and the hope and the many, many helping hands that pulled us from the rubble to begin the journey to a future that we are traveling each day with sweat and with dignity. Thank you. And thank you.
It's been an honor to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Tom.
Great pleasure for me, too. Thanks.
Good stuff.
In addition to publishing every day during and after the hurricane and hand-delivering the newspapers, Stan Tyner's Biloxi Sun Herald has published 2 books about Katrina. Ellis Anderson is a freelance writer and photographer. Under Surge, Under Siege, which grew from her journal and blog, is her first book. And Tom Piazza, who writes primarily about music, won a 2004 Grammy for Best Album Notes. He's written 2 books about the hurricane's impact on New Orleans. To see images of the Mississippi Gulf Coast recovery 5 years after Katrina, please visit our website at www.mpbonline.org. You can also listen to the entire interview, find lesson plans, and other interesting links. Katrina also inspired songwriter Molly Fitzpatrick.
When the rains fall and the waters rise and the winds come and blow me down, when the earth moves right before your eyes, we will lead each other back to solid ground. We will lead each other back to solid ground.
Writers is made possible in part by a generous grant from the William Battle and Sarah Mel Repshire Crooks Foundation, celebrating the legacy of Mississippi's Eudora Welty. For a copy of this program, call 601-432-6294 or go to www.mpbonline.org. Please note the name and date of the program.